If one were to design a congregant just like you want, if a rabbi were given that option, by the way, we never are, you'd be hard-pressed to come up with a better, more involved, educated, partnering type of person than Rahel Fried, who is our speaker this evening. She is an active member of this congregation. She is involved in education here at the temple. She comes to almost all the celebrations we have here. She has been involved in governance. She is a student of Torah and many other things. She is a teacher. She's a fellow traveler. We've gone to Israel with her. It was just a joy because she takes joy, Jewish joy, in just about everything she does. Rahel Fried is a senior fellow at the University of Minnesota's Center for Spirituality and Healing. She's a clinical social worker, licensed marriage and family therapist, an adult educator, a public speaker, and author. Rahel designs and delivers contemporary legacy programs that are based on both sacred and ancient tradition of the ethical will. Her professional work includes teaching secondary English, serving in the Peace Corps in Tunisia, and founding the first program in Minnesota for families of the dying at Mount Sinai Hospital in Minneapolis. Mostly what I like to say about Rahel is that when you need someone to partner with something you want to make true, to make happen for Temple, she is always the go-to person. And so we are very blessed by her presence on a day-to-day basis. And tonight we're blessed to have her as our speaker from our Views-Pews series, as she will talk about this evening. Rahel.
Thank you, Rabbi Victor. And thank you for inviting me to speak tonight about the ethical will. A more personal statement of who I am and the purpose of my debar tonight is, I'm an aging, hippie, opinionated woman, a feminist, a student of Torah, a mother of 2, and a grandmother of 7. This combination, this perspective, the lens I look through much of the time. Perhaps more important, I'm a passionate believer in our responsibility to pass on our values and love to future generations. Let me begin with some history. Some 2,000 years ago, the rabbis taught fathers to write letters to their sons that pass our cultural traditions to the next generations. The letters could also articulate death and dying preferences. Their template came from Torah, chapter 49, the last chapter in Genesis, when a dying Jacob blessed his sons and asked them not to leave his bones down in Egypt, but to take them back to the cave at Machpelah that Abraham had bought so that he could be for eternity with his ancestors. To clarify and differentiate the ethical will from others, let me just say that most of you have a will. It's what you use to disperse your valuables. Many of you have a living will or a health directive to request your treatment at the end of life. But probably few of you have an ethical will, and most of you don't even know what that is. The first ethical will I heard was read on this very bima 19 years ago on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Joe Black's sermon was the ethical will he had written to his son Ethan, who had been born on Rosh Hashanah. It moved many of us to tears, and I want to read a couple of paragraphs from it. He began with an introduction to the congregation, explaining how personal his sermon was going to be that morning of Yom Kippur. And here's a paragraph from that part of the ethical will. There's a wonderful Jewish tradition where parents write a document in which they bequeath a spiritual and ethical legacy to their children. These documents, called ethical wills, date back to biblical and Talmudic times. In an ethical will, parents write a letter to a child and attempt to convey what a lifetime of trial and error has taught them. And then he went on to read his 7-page letter to Ethan. In it, he spoke of awe and reverence, seeing God's presence when witnessing a birth, and more. Here's one paragraph from that part of his ethical will. Ethan, your mother and I want you to accomplish great things in your lifetime. We want you to soar to the moon. We want you to achieve all that you can. But in the process, don't ever let your accomplishments get in the way of your humanity. Don't ever think that you are invincible, that you have no limits. All of us walk a tightrope between our abilities and our limitations. And he concluded, may your first new year be filled with joy. I love you, Dad. So how did I get involved in this work? I'd been introduced to the concept first by listening to Rabbi Joe Black, and then in 1995 at a women's group, Rabbi Edelheit taught us about the ethical will, and I was fascinated immediately and raced home to write it to my 2 kids. A couple of years passed. I attended a Kala, a gathering, sponsored by the URJ. It was 4 days of study, music, food, schmoozing, worship. It was a veritable Garden of Eden. I took a workshop there in the ethical will with Rabbi Larry Raphael. The second year I went back, he was teaching, I went to the class again. The third year I went and he was teaching and I went into class and he was reading a poem and I was sitting listening and I heard a voice in my head. And the voice said, turn this into a healing tool for women. Now, I told you who I was. I'm not exactly the person whose voice was in my head. It's the first time I heard a voice, and it's the last time I heard a voice. So I raised up my hand, and he called on me, and I told him what I had heard, and he pointed his finger at me, and he said, do it. It's an important niche. At that moment, my future work was revealed. It was to understand this powerful patriarchal tradition of ours and to transform it into a contemporary healing process, accessible for everyone, but particularly for women whose voices and values have not been expressed and preserved for the future. Having been a teacher, a social worker, and a facilitator, it was natural for me to build a curriculum and start teaching. I started with the premise that the ethical will was neither an inviting name nor accessible, so I called it legacy writing. And though we all want to influence our children, instructions that the rabbi spoke seemed harsh to me. Always rebellious, I usually ignored instructions that came at me. However, I was open to blessings. So I transformed instructions to blessings, which became the central idea in the work of legacy writing. I taught that instruction came from our heads and blessings came from our hearts. The Talmud says it better. Even though the sages said there are 3 instructions a man must give, still one should be careful to say these things gently so that his family will accept them from him. As I began this work, I stood on the shoulders of the Jewish feminist Judith Plaskow, who in 1999 wrote a book called Standing Again at Sinai. She believed that making our sidurs gender neutral was good, but not enough. She called for Judaism to include women in every part of our tradition, including women in the tradition of writing the ethical will was my small part. We all need to bless and be blessed. men and women, young and old. As it's true today, we find it in the Torah too. So if we go back to the Jacob, who was the template for the ethical will originally, earlier in his life, he stole Esau, his twin brother's blessing. And when Esau found out, he went to his father Isaac and said, the tenderest line in Genesis to my mind, "Have you no blessing for me, Father?" So in 2001, I began, writing Women's Lives and Women's Legacies, passing your beliefs and blessings to future generations. My hypothesis was that legacy thinking and writing has a healing effect on those who write, as well as those who receive legacy letters. As I facilitated programs and workshops, I observed deep universal needs that we weren't even aware that we had that were being met by this writing. The need to belong, the need to be known, the need to be remembered, the need to make a positive difference, the need to bless and be blessed, and to celebrate life. I was concerned that the book would be accessible only to privileged, educated, white, perhaps Jewish women, and I wanted it to reach all women. So I connected with a social worker at Shakopee Women's Prison to volunteer to do a series of legacy programs there. I explained the work and the needs that I believed were met, and she responded favorably, saying she had the perfect group for me. I said, "Really, what is it?" And she said, "The lifers." I was terrified. I asked her why, and she said, "Well, didn't I say that one of the needs that would be met would be to be remembered?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "These are women whose families are trying to forget them." So I began an 8-week program at Shakopee to test whether or not all women would benefit from his work. A dozen women came. They were Latina, African American, Caucasian, there was even a Vietnamese woman. On the third evening of the class, Maria came in early and she looked very depressed, and I said to her, "Maria, are you all right?" And she said, "Well, Sunday afternoon is visiting day, and my people are in Oklahoma. But I was talking to my daughter on the phone, she just had a baby, and I could hear the baby cooing in the phone." She's by this time crying. And she said, "I don't think I will ever hold my granddaughter, and I don't think I may ever see my granddaughter." By this time, I'm crying also. An African American woman had come up and was listening to her story, and she turned to her when she finished and she said, "Well, Maria, ever since we started working with Rachel, I decided that I was going to write one sentence every day to my granddaughter, Sophia." She said, "Some days I can't think of anything to write, and I'll look out the window and I'll write, 'Sophia, this morning I saw an Oriole.'" And as she was saying this, Maria's energy was rising, and she looked at her and she said, "Well, I could do that. I'm going to do that." And the two of them walked off to sit down for class. So I knew that not only was this one of the holiest groups I ever worked with, but that this work was going to address all women. Oops. In 2009, I was invited to lead a legacy workshop at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. I was thrilled and again terrified. How can I balance my respect for their commitment to telling their story over and over again to visitors at the museum for 60 years and tell them that I think they have other legacies that they may be able to pass forward to their children and their grandchildren and some of them great-grandchildren. So I created an exercise asking them to remember a person or an incident that was from before the Holocaust. After they wrote, several of them shared. Oh, I forgot to write this. There we go. And Dora Clayman generously gave me her letter to use for educational purposes. And I want to read a portion of that letter to you. To my 3 dear grandchildren, I want to reintroduce you to your maternal great-great-grandfather and hope you will someday tell his story to your own grandchildren. I visited him in Ludbreg, Croatia, where he lived, but I was just a little older than 3. I hope you will feel as proud of him now as I did then. In that town, beggars came knocking on doors and asking for alms every Saturday and Wednesday, market days in that small town. But of course, they didn't come to our door on Saturday, Shabbat. But on Wednesdays, my grandfather would set up a little table in the garden when the weather was good, and in the hallway when in bad weather. On the table, he would arrange little piles of change, and as the beggars, accustomed to this, and sometimes a gypsy or 2 came by, my grandfather would greet them and hand them each a little pile of money. I was fascinated by all of this then, and have remembered it always as a lesson to be kind to the less fortunate and always be as generous as possible. I hope that each of you, no matter what you choose to do with your lives, will never forget this simple lesson, this legacy from my grandfather, to pay attention to other people's needs and to be always as generous as you can be. Much love from your grandmother, Dora. Another story, this one about writing legacy letters to bless the future as we're dying. The story is about Lenny Champer, who I sat next to at tourist study for years. I visited him at Breukenberg one day not long before he went into hospice at Sholem. He was trying to stay alive to meet his yet unborn grandson. I suggested that he could write a letter to his unborn, and as he was asking me what to write, another friend arrived in his room. I left and thought, if anybody could guide his writing, it was me. So I went home and I wrote to him, and I'll read you a part of what I wrote. Lenny, first write a letter to your unborn grandson, and perhaps to his also unborn siblings and cousins, who you're fighting to stay alive to be able to hold in your arms. In the letter, tell him everything you want me here to tell him as he grows up. Grandfather and wisdom. Tell him how much you love him, how much you wish you could be here to watch him grow to manhood, to see him graduate from college, to share the joy of him finding purposeful work and experiencing a loving and meaningful relationship with another. Never mind that to understand the letter, he'll have to reread it many times. Tell him who you are and what you loved and appreciated about your life. Tell him your favorite stories about his mom and his aunts, but most of all, tell him stories about your life. The things that have been most important to you, the values you hold to this day, the events that made you the complex man you became. Tell him about your humor and your desire to make people laugh, and so much more, so he'll know his grandfather. And finally, tell him what you hope and dream for him, and for the world he'll live his life in. Bless him with your very personal words and love. And after all of that, if your energy permits, write a letter to each or all 3 together of your daughters. And finally, write letters to anyone with whom you've unfinished business. Let yourself forgive them. Putting that on paper releases you, whether you choose to enclose those letters in envelopes to be given to them now or after you're gone, or not. Presenting a letter is a different choice than writing for your own peace of mind. Please know that every word you write will be treasured by your loved ones, and that the very reality of you writing to and for them is a blessing they will treasure. Your words will nourish them, encourage them, inspire them, and will live as a blessing long beyond your years. Well, Lenny did live to see his grandson. We were all invited to Sholem. We We got to hold him, we got to celebrate with him, and soon after that, he did pass away. And at his funeral, his 3 daughters gave eulogies, and with tears in their eyes, spoke about how important were the letters their father had left each of them. Now a word about the Temple Legacy Project. It's a way for you to participate communally. We're building an archive of congregant stories about who you are personally as part of the Temple community. We have over 50 interviews recorded so far. The people who work with me on this project, and without them, of course, it could not have happened, include Barbara Furman, my co-chair and interviewer, Alex Sloan, our ever-ready videographer, Len Kennan, our techie who translates recordings to DVDs, others who have helped to log and code the interviews, and Wendy Schwartz, our staff liaison. We're also building a named We're also building a names archive as part of the Legacy Project. We ask each person interviewed to fill out the names form because names are so important. They are our first legacy. We're born and we get a name. Our names connect us to our families and to our tribe. Having a name also addresses our need to belong. Simply, here's how we structure the interviews. We ask people to tell us their Jewish story. We ask them to tell their temple story. We ask them their thoughts and feelings about Israel. And we ask them how they want to be remembered. And now my last story, which is about Doris Sherman, who Alex and I interviewed in the library at Sholem. Most of our interviews are done here in our very own library. When we finished, I was thanking her, and she said, no, she needed to thank me, that she felt honored to be included. And I realized for the very first time that building an archive for Temple was also meeting important needs for interviewees too. To be known and to be heard, to review their lives, to articulate what means most to them, and to feel they have a unique place in the eternal life of the Temple and the Jewish community. If you're interested in being interviewed for the project or want to help with the project, please contact me. I hope you now understand the importance and urgency of writing legacy letters, and that you'll be inspired to leave ethical wills for your loved ones. One resource that can assist you is my new book, Your Legacy Matters. It's a guide for both men and women, parents of young children, boomers, and people in the last bit of their lives. The other is a one-page free email that I send out every month. It's called Legacy Tips and Tools. You can subscribe on the Life-Legacies website. It includes a short reflection about a legacy topic, and it also has suggestions for writing. It's a tool to keep the legacy perspective and topics refreshed, to convert into blessings and letters for your loved ones. I'd like to close with a legacy blessing for each of you. Know that your loved ones will be enriched by your legacies. Your blessings will teach them love. Your memories will fill gaps in their history. Your values, expressed through your stories and learning, will help them know you and will inspire them in joyful and troubled times. May your life continue to be blessed with abundance and gratitude to share. May your legacy be an eternal link between you and those you love, between you and the generations who came before you, and between you and the generations who will come after you. Please join me in singing You Shall Be a Blessing, a moving song Debbie Friedman left us as part of her legacy to our community and the world